They said she was finished. They said no soul could walk away from the kind of men who hunted her. Folks out here don't usually leave second chances lying in the dirt, not in a land where mercy is thinner than rain. But she wasn't like the others. When most would run, she stood still. When most would beg, she whispered, "Let them come." It wasn't pride, not really. It was survival dressed in fire. The kind you only find in a woman who's been broken once and refuses to break again. And beside her stood a rancher, quiet, tired, carrying scars only the desert knew. His steel wasn't just loaded in his gun. It was carved into his bones. The land stretched wide and merciless, the kind of open that swallows men whole. Dust rolled across the plains like a restless tide, and the sun burned low, dragging shadows long across the hard-pan earth. Out here, silence wasn't empty. It was alive, carrying the weight of every secret ever buried beneath cracked soil. The wind spoke in whispers, rattling old fence posts, pushing against the brittle bones of forgotten barns. The ranch itself was nothing more than a scar on the desert. A crooked house with peeling boards, a corral half broken, and a water well that groaned louder than it gave. Still, it stood like the man who kept it. Days bled into one another under skies too wide for comfort, nights broken only by coyotes calling to the moon. It was a country that didn't forgive and didn't care to. Yet, within that harsh silence, something lived, something stubborn, a fire that refused to go out, even as the desert tried its best to smother it. It was here in this stretch of lonely dust and dying fences that two souls would collide, and nothing afterward would ever belong to silence again. He was known only as Mercer to most folks, though once he had a first name that carried weight. Out here, names didn't last long. The desert sand wore them down the way it wore down boots, horses, and men. Mercer carried himself like a man who had already paid his dues in full, quiet, watchful, never one to waste a word unless it mattered. His shoulders were broad, but bent with years of work and years of carrying things no man should have to. Once long ago, he had ridden with soldiers, the kind who believed the war would change something. All it had done was carve ghosts into his memory and leave scars on his skin. He'd seen too much blood spilled in places where the ground still drank it. And when he came home, there wasn't much left of him but a pair of tired hands and a gun he swore he'd never draw again unless it was the last choice he had. Now he lived on the edge of town, keeping mostly to himself. Folks called him cold, but the truth was simpler. Mercer had been burned so many times he stopped standing too close to the fire. Still, under all that steel and silence, there was a kind of stubborn decency that hadn't died. It showed in the way he kept fences mended even when no cattle grazed, in the way he offered water to strangers even when the well was running low. She came out of the horizon the way storms do, sudden, heavy, and carrying trouble in her shadow. Her dress was torn in places, dust caked into every thread, but her steps didn't waver. Most women in her condition would have bowed their heads, hidden their eyes. Not her. She looked forward, chin raised, as if daring the desert itself to strike her down. No one in town knew where she came from, and she didn't offer answers. There were whispers she'd been running for days, maybe weeks, from men who wanted her cornered. Others claimed she'd been sold off somewhere back east and clawed her way out of chains. Whatever the truth was, it lived in her eyes, a fire that burned hotter than her fear. There was a cut across her cheek, half-healed, and bruises that told of rough hands. But even broken skin couldn't hide the defiance in her face. She carried herself like someone who had already survived more than most men ever would. She didn't speak much, but when she did, her voice was low, steady, and sharp enough to cut through silence. It was this mix of mystery and unyielding strength that made her impossible to ignore. To the rancher, she wasn't just another wanderer. She was a storm that had found its way to his land, and he knew storms never arrived without a reason. It was near sundown when their paths finally crossed. Mercer had been working the corral, patching up a rail that hadn't held steady in years, when he saw her figure moving across the open stretch. At first, he thought it was a trick of the heat, the way the desert sometimes bent light and made ghosts walk. But as she drew closer, the dust followed her steps, and he realized she was flesh and bone, worn thin but standing strong. She didn't ask permission when she reached the edge of his land. She just stopped, breathing hard, her hands hanging loose at her sides. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Mercer's hand brushed against the butt of his revolver, not drawing it, just remembering it was there. Her eyes locked on his, unblinking, steady as steel. Then, with a voice rough from distance and dry air, she said the words that carried weight heavier than any plea. Let them come. That was all. No name, no story, just those 3 words, thrown into the dying light like a challenge. And in them, Mercer heard not just defiance, but the echo of his own weary soul. Mercer didn't answer right away. He wasn't a man who wasted words, and she wasn't a woman who needed them. The silence between them carried more truth than any talk could. She didn't lower her gaze, and he didn't look away. He saw the bruises, the torn fabric, the grit in her step. But more than that, he saw the refusal in her eyes, the same refusal that had kept him alive all these years. And in her steady breath, she recognized something in him too, the kind of strength that comes from standing alone too long. Without asking, Mercer nodded toward the porch. She stepped forward, not as a beggar, not as a guest, but as someone who had already claimed a place. There was no welcome, no thanks, just a quiet understanding that, from this moment on, neither of them stood alone. Word in a small town travels faster than any rider, and by morning, folks already had something to say. A stranger woman showing up on Mercer's land was enough to stir every tongue. The blacksmith muttered she must be running from a debt. The saloon girl swore she had the look of someone bought and sold. A few even whispered darker things, that she carried curses in her shadow, that any man who sheltered her would end up in the ground. Mercer heard the talk when he rode in for supplies. He didn't answer it. He never did. But the way he stood, the way his hand rested quiet near his holster, made most men swallow their words when he passed. Still, gossip has a way of growing teeth. It wasn't long before certain voices began to say out loud what others only thought, that she didn't belong, not in their town, not on his land. Back at the ranch, she felt it too. The way eyes followed her whenever she set foot near the edge of town, the weight of suspicion pressing against her back. She didn't flinch. She never did. But Mercer saw the way her jaw tightened, the way her silence grew heavier. And in that silence, he knew, it wasn't just her fight anymore. It happened 3 days later, just as the sun was sinking red into the horizon. The kind of evening where the desert looked painted in blood. Mercer was on the porch, oiling his rifle out of habit more than need, when he heard it, the steady thunder of hooves rolling in from the west. He set the rifle down slow and stood, eyes narrowing. 5 riders crested the ridge, dark shapes against the firelit sky. They came down hard, dust curling around their horses' legs. Men like that didn't ride in for talk. They rode in to claim. Their leader, a tall figure with a scar running from his brow to his jaw, pulled his horse up just shy of the gate. His grin was sharp, ugly as a snake's. "Evening, Mercer," the man called, voice thick with arrogance. "Seems you got yourself company. We've come to collect what's ours." The woman stepped out from the shadows of the porch. She didn't hide, didn't cower. She just stood there, eyes burning, her voice steady when she spoke. "I don't belong to you." The men laughed, the kind of laugh that carries cruelty in its echo. One leaned forward, spitting into the dirt. "Ain't up to you, girl. You know how this goes." Mercer's hand brushed his revolver, but he didn't draw. Not yet. His voice was calm, even, but it carried the weight of iron. "She ain't yours. She ain't anyone's." The scarred man's grin faded. Tension settled heavy in the air, the kind that made even the wind hold its breath. 5 against 1, and yet Mercer stood steady, the woman at his side. The night was about to choose its side, and nothing would stay the same after. The scarred man dismounted slow, boots sinking into the dust as he walked forward. His men shifted in their saddles, restless, hands brushing the grips of their pistols. Mercer stayed still, his stance solid, eyes fixed, but he knew the odds. 5 guns against his 1. Steel alone wouldn't win this fight. That's when she stepped past him, bare feet on dry earth, chin high, shoulders squared as if the desert itself had chosen her to speak. The rider sneered, but she didn't flinch. Her voice cut through the heavy air, low and fierce, carrying more power than any bullet. "You think you broke me," she said, her words steady, each one a strike of fire. "You think I'll crawl back because you ride in with dust and noise. But look close, boys. You left me to die out there, and I'm still standing." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The men shifted, uneasy. Their leader's smirk faltered, just enough to show the crack beneath it. Mercer's eyes never left her. He'd seen soldiers face cannon fire without trembling, but he had never seen courage like this, born not from pride, but from survival, from fury, from the refusal to bow ever again. "You can drag me, chain me, kill me if you like," she went on, voice rising, "but you'll never own me. Not now, not ever." The scarred man opened his mouth to laugh, but no sound came. Her fire had stolen the air from his lungs. And in that silence, with her words burning hotter than the setting sun, the fight had already shifted. The scarred man's jaw tightened as he searched for words, but none came that didn't sound hollow against the fire she'd lit. His horse stamped restlessly behind him, sensing the break in its master's will. The other riders shifted uneasily, eyes darting between Mercer's hand resting on his revolver and the woman who refused to bend. Mercer finally spoke, voice low, calm, but sharp as a drawn blade. "You heard her. Now ride on." The scarred man glanced at him, trying to measure whether Mercer would truly pull that trigger. But what he saw in the rancher's eyes wasn't bluff or bravado. It was resolve carved deep, the kind that didn't shake, the kind that had already survived worse nights than this. The silence stretched long, heavy as a hanging rope. Then, with a curse under his breath, the scarred man swung back into his saddle. "This ain't finished," he growled, his pride cut deeper than any wound. With a tug of the reins, he turned his horse, the others following, the dust of their retreat rising into the dusk. Only when the hoofbeats faded into the distance did Mercer ease his stance. The woman hadn't moved. She stood as she had from the start, unbroken, steady, her fire untamed. And in that moment, under the bleeding light of the sky, victory wasn't loud or bloody. It was quiet. It was survival. When the riders were gone, silence fell heavy across the ranch. Not the usual silence of the desert, but the kind that comes after a storm when even the wind seems too tired to move. Mercer lowered his hand from the revolver and leaned back against the porch post, steadying his breath. He'd been in standoffs before, but this one had felt different, not because of the guns, but because of her. She stayed in the yard, shoulders squared, though her hands trembled just enough for him to notice. Yet she didn't look shaken. If anything, she looked freer, as if speaking those words had broken the last chain they'd tried to bind her with. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The desert around them carried the weight of everything unspoken: fear, defiance, and the strange beginning of trust. The days that followed moved slower, softer, as if the land itself respected what had been won. She stayed, not because she asked, but because neither of them spoke of her leaving. In the mornings, Mercer found her walking the fence lines, her hands brushing against the wood as though she was learning the rhythm of the place. By noon, she was hauling buckets from the well, patching rails, or feeding the animals with the same quiet determination she'd carried since the day she arrived. Mercer didn't thank her. He wasn't the kind of man who dressed moments in words. But he noticed. The corral looked stronger. The air inside the house felt less empty. Even the nights seemed different. The silence carried something gentler now, less lonely. Healing didn't come fast. It never does in the desert. But piece by piece, the weight lifted. She found steadiness in the work, and he found something he thought he'd lost forever. Company that didn't demand, didn't pry, just stayed. And that, out here, was more valuable than gold. It wasn't long before another wanderer found his way to Mercer's land. A boy no older than 16, with dust in his hair and hunger carved deep into his face. He didn't ask for food, Just water, though the way his hand shook made clear he hadn't eaten in days. The woman saw him first. She stepped forward, the same fire in her eyes, but this time it wasn't defiance, it was recognition. She knew the look of someone who had been chased too far, someone who carried fear like a second skin. Without hesitation, she handed him bread from the table. Mercer watched quietly. He didn't protest. He just nodded, the way he always did when he knew something true. The ranch was no longer a place for one-man silence. Slowly, it was becoming a shelter for the broken, for the lost, for those who refused to stay owned. One evening, as the sun slipped low and painted the desert in gold, she stood out by the fence line, something small clutched in her hand. Mercer didn't ask, but he saw it, the ragged piece of cloth, torn from the dress she had worn the night she arrived. It was stained, frayed, carrying every mark of what she had endured. She looked at it for a long while, her face calm, steady. Then, without ceremony, she opened her hand and let the wind take it. The scrap lifted, caught in the fading light, and carried off across the endless plain until it was gone. Mercer didn't speak, and she didn't explain. Some things didn't need words. In that simple act, the past had loosened its grip, and the desert, once a place of chains, had become something else, a place where beginnings could take root. The West was never gentle. It tested every soul that dared to cross its dust and silence. But sometimes, out in the harshest places, the strongest truths were found. A man scarred by war, a woman scarred by secrets, a boy scarred by hunger. They came together not through blood nor fortune, but through the simple will to keep going. And maybe that's the real heart of the frontier. Not the gunfights, not the gold, not even the wide horizons, but the way broken people stitch themselves back together, piece by piece, under the same sky. Out here, survival wasn't just about living another day. It was about finding someone who saw you, stayed anyway, and called that place, no matter how barren, home.